Hi and welcome back to the Sword Studies series. I'm Nick Thomas at the Academy of Historical Fencing, and today we're going to take a look at this mid-18th century British dragoon sword. So this dragoon sword, this is a form of basket hilt, but as you can see it's not a complete basket. So typically when we think of a basket hilt, you would assume that the bars that protect the hand go all the way around both sides, and there are a lot of basket hilts that are like that. The traditional, of course, Scottish basket hilts are normally that way. But there was a range of basket hilts that we would usually call 3/4 or half baskets, depending on how far the protection goes, that have basically limited inside protection to the hand, and for the simple reason that it's much easier to wear and carry, and also to draw. So when the sword is resting on your side, and this particular dragoon sword was held with, you see this frog stud here, so this would have been carried in a standard shoulder belt that would have crossed across the body. The frog stud holds it in place, so this wouldn't flop around like certain, say, two-ring suspension systems. This was held close to the side, and the reduced inner basket means that there's less getting in the way against your uniform, less wear against the uniform. It's more comfortable, and also getting to the drawer is also quicker and easier. So functionally in the fight, this has no advantages whatsoever. In actual fact, it does pull the weight a little bit to one side, which is not so ideal for edge alignment. But a sword spends most of its time in the scabbard on the side, and so often some of the most important features to a sword is what is it like to live with day to day? What's it like to wear, to carry, to just, to have to live with on a daily basis? And as a result, a lot of swords have reduced inner guards like this, like we saw on the Grenadier officer's sword on the last video. People typically think of basket hilts as Scottish. Of course, the design of basket hilts were used all across the British Isles. Into the 18th century, basket hilts became far less common for British troops generally, and they generally started to favour more hangers and spadroons and then sabres eventually as well. But some basket hilts did carry on well into the 18th century, and one example of that is the dragoon sword. So typically we think of a dragoon as basically a mounted infantryman, and through some parts of the 18th century there were, as time progressed on, dragoon just started to mean cavalrymen, and they did very little dismounted. But in the mid-18th century, therefore, this is designed very much as an in-between sword. It's designed for a good fighting sword from horseback and on foot, and also at this point, which is really quite important, is there were no light cavalry for the British until around about the 1750s. So they were the sort of light cavalry, you think of the Hussars and stuff like that, were coming in a bit earlier than that for other European nations. Britain was a bit slow to adopt light cavalry. And of course, light cavalry tend to be equipped with lighter swords, usually curved swords, and the first light cavalry British sabres were exactly that in the 1750s, is a very simple hilted curved blade. So these dragoon swords, in some regards, they're kind of a heavy cavalry sword, but they're also a mounted infantry sword at the same time. Good all-rounder. And they're big and beefy and strong. They've got good reach. And this one, as you can see, has its original leather scabbard, which is quite rare and unusual to see. Now, if we draw it out from there for a moment, so you'll see that this blade is single-edged. It is what we would call a back sword, although it's important to note that by around about the mid-18th century, the term backsword was fallen from use, and for the most part, these swords were then just called broadswords, and they didn't differentiate between the single and double-edged versions. It was just, this is a big straight sword, and therefore it's a broadsword. And yeah, being a backsword, it's blunt along the back edge. It has no sharpened back edge, which is important to note because some swords have, even if they are single-edged, like sabres for example, have a sharpened back edge that can deliver back edge cuts. British swords, in my experience, usually don't, and that's not so surprising because it wasn't taught in the systems of swordsmanship that were used. There's one example of a back edge cut in British 18th century texts. That's the only example. So clearly it did happen occasionally, but was not the norm. And the vast majority of 18th century swords that I've ever handled, and early 19th, British that is, don't have a sharpened back edge. You'll notice that it's double fullered. It has the long fuller running along the back, and the secondary fuller starts around about here, which is a little unusual. And you'll notice it has a reasonable amount of profile taper and reasonable amount of distal taper, I would say. So the guard, looking from the front, this style we would typically call a kind of a slot hilt style. It's a very simple slot hilt, and the style is followed on from the front and the side. Let's look at some specification. The sword weighs 1.18 kilos, so just under 1.2 kilos. If we take some measurements, the blade is 84.5 centimeters, that's 33¼ inches, and the balance point. Now you notice the hilt is heavy on this. It's the case with a lot of basket hilts, is a lot of the baskets can really bring the balance back. The balance is 7.5 centimeters from the guard. And so, what you have here is a sword with a good amount of reach. You know, it's pushing close to 34 inch, good amount of reach. The balance is fairly far back, but it has a fair bit of mass in the tip. It's a fairly rigid blade, so it's a good overall cut and thruster. It has a massive amount of protection. Even though it doesn't have this inner section here, it still has a lot on top, and this front section does cover much of the hand in much the same way that, say, a figure 8 cutlass does, is that the big, almost disc-shaped section on the front provides a lot of frontal and side protection. So, and even though it doesn't have, you know, maximum protection of a full basket hilt, it still has a lot. And the hilt itself, I can tell you, is really heavy duty. Now, I've handled quite a few basket hilts, and they vary. Some English ones can be really thin, for example, on the bars. This is unusually beastly, and I would say that's quite fitting of it being a Dragoon sword, because they're designed, obviously, to be a brutish fighting force. Now, the grip is, it looks like it is a worn down shagreen, but it could be leather. Hard to tell because it's been coated. And it's wire wrapped, which would suggest that this is an officer's sword, but it's not certain, but it's likely. So likely a Dragoon officer's sword in the kind of 1750 to, let's say, about 1770 period. It could be a little bit before, could have been used a little bit before that as well, but it's approximately around about 1750 into about 1770. Now, this particular form of basket, two things to say about it on top, really. One, it has no front loops, so it's really common for basket hilts to have loops that go from the quillen kind of section onto the side of the guard, and people argue endlessly about what they're for. Personally, I think they're just a protective element because this part of the basket gets just hammered constantly, and therefore I think it's an advanced guard to take some of those impacts before it gets down to the hand. And this doesn't have it, and well, mainly I would say it's because it's just been built in a simple constructive method, and these bars are really, really thick, and so it's not so important. It's got a lot of protection up on top there. And the other point to mention is that this overall hilt form is often called an Irish hilt, and that is because of its association with the Inniskillen Dragoons, which did use this hilt. However, they had quite a unique looking pommel, which is not this shape, whereas this kind of flattened dome section is just very typically British in the early 18th century. And so this might have been for, say, when, you know, like the Irish regiments, like the Inniskillens, but there were other three-quarter baskets or half baskets used throughout, and so I'm not entirely sure if you could say for definite that's quite what it is. So, what else is there to say about this sword? Well, the main thing I can just tell you is it's a good all-rounder. It has good reach, it has good cutting power, it thrusts perfectly well. The balance is nicely far back because of that heavy hilt. The only thing I don't particularly like about it is the amount of pull that it gets to one side, because unlike that grenadier sword that I showed, which does have protection all on the one side, because this is so beastly in its level of thickness of guard protection, it does pull off to one side. Not the end of the world, I could manage with it, but it is more noticeable than say that grenadier officer's sword. Let's look at a few more blade stats. Okay, distal taper, only 6 mil down at the shoulder, so that's unusual. Yeah. At the halfway point, 3.5, about 10 to 15 centimeters from the blade, it goes down to 1.9, and in the tip, it goes down to 1.1. Its profile taper is 3.5 at the shoulder, 2.73 in the midpoint, 2.2 close to the tip, about 10 centimeters from the tip. So reasonable amount of distal taper. As I said, only a 6 mil thick blade, which I tend to prefer the 8s. Although, because this is a reasonably meaty blade, it's not so noticeable on its flexibility and overall striking power. So there you have it. You notice it's quite a large hilt as well. Some basket hilts are really quite compact and really quite restrictive, but it's a feature that I've noticed of British Dragoons sort of basket hilts in the mid to late 18th century, that a lot of them are very oversized, and particularly if you look at, say, what's called the 1788 heavy cavalry dragoon hilts, they tend to be really large. The grips are long and the guards are really large, and I suspect that's probably in large part to give more protection and also counterbalance some of their very long blades, because some of them have kind of 38-inch blades and this is only just under 34. So in the dragoon sword category of that time, this is at the smaller end of the scale. Some of them push 38-inch blades and up to kind of 1.4, 1.5 kilos, so they could be much bigger and meatier than this. So this is actually, as far as dragoon swords go of the period, this is a really nice all-rounder that I think would suit both use on foot and on horseback. So there you go. There's all the measurements for the dragoon sword of approximately 1750, what is often called the Irish hilt. Thanks for watching. I will get onto the next video because I have a lot of swords to get through. Please do subscribe if you haven't already.